Our next speaker this morning is Lina Rosenberg Foley. She is the University Archivist at Lawrence University here in Appleton. In her role at Lawrence, she manages the university's archives and records management program and provides archival and reference services in the library. Her work focuses on streamlining archival processes and services to maximize productivity within her one-person department. So I'm sure a lot of you also have one-person departments who can sympathize with her and learn a lot from her. So welcome, Lina.
Thank you. Yes, I am very excited to be here and talk to folks who are, in many cases, in my situation. So a brief description of myself for visual accessibility, which is something I picked up from a recent conference, and I highly recommend everyone to do these days. I'm a young white woman with curly light brown hair. I'm wearing a purple dress and a black sweater, and I'm sitting behind me is a tan wall with a blue door and a fire extinguisher. So today I'm going to talk about digitization on demand, which is something you might have heard about or have been curious about before. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we implement that here at Lawrence and kind of some guiding principles to follow with that. So next. So the setup, I started here at Lawrence about 2 years ago. I have a background in both museum collections management and digital projects. So that definitely has influenced my approach to being a lone arranger archivist here at Lawrence. I have been focusing a lot of our efforts on digitization initiatives here because I am one person, and finding the time to fulfill research requests among all of my other duties is hard to come by. The University Archives is nested within the library here at Lawrence. Like I said, I'm a one-person department. I do have a small amount of student labor, which I try to use as wisely as possible because I don't have volunteers here. I'm not really set up in a way that can accommodate volunteers easily. In addition to being the university archivist, I also oversee our records management policy here at Lawrence. Most of my time these days has been dedicated to that. At the end of the academic year, that often happens. I also do provide library reference services. I'm one of the librarians here on staff as well. So it means I don't have a lot of time to do much of anything, it feels like, let alone digitization, which is where digitization on demand comes in handy. I definitely take a piecemeal approach to all of this. So it is a little bit kind of ebbs and flows as we go through the academic year and when things are more intensive towards archival work or records management work or library work for that matter as a reference librarian. So most people have tight budgets or small staffs and additional duties like me. So I assume you're not all easily equipped to do massive digitization projects, right? So the archives also, we create multiple types of digital materials here. They're presented to the public in 3 different ways. I'll briefly go over those 3 sort of houses that our digital records live in, though the platforms are sort of irrelevant to the way that we approach digitization overall. But I do think that understanding what we use will give some context to our process. We have different standards for what gets presented on each platform, and each platform has their own standards for materials. So if you're in the market for a digital platform, be sure to keep those things in mind as you look on the market. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the specific technologies. Obviously, they're sort of irrelevant to our methodologies. But I should also note that the first 2 houses or the first 2 platforms are maintained by our digital collections librarian rather than myself. So sort of that administrative work is done outside of the archives. I just get to tag along, which is pretty great. So the first one in here, house number 1 is Lux. That is Lawrence's digital repository. It is primarily used for the presentation to the public of scholarly work done by the institution. We have a section on the website here that we use to present publications mostly from our collections. So that's student newspapers, yearbooks, course catalogs, commencement programs. We also have some other miscellaneous items that are not publications here. We also have oral histories and university presidential portraits as well, because those are housed in the archives. In terms of using Lux, it is a digital commons platform. Again, I don't do anything with the backend. I send our digital collections librarian all the material I want to upload with the metadata, and she does that for me, which is really nice. We also, I should mention, the Lawrence University Archives also collects the history of Milwaukee Downer College, which merged with Lawrence in 1964. So if you see that name pop up as well, that's where that comes from. So next, please. Great. Digitized photographs as well as individual documents from our collections are presented online via Artstore. It's an Ithaca product. They also run JSTOR. As you can tell, there's an academic institution theme here. It's largely intended for art museum collections. It's geared towards an educational audience. We use Artstore because it works nicely in conjunction with the collections presented by the Riston Art Galleries here on campus, as well as some other collections on campus that are used for teaching purposes. So it doesn't quite work perfectly for archival presentations, but it gets the job done in many ways. I will also note that these two products have a bit of a clash with each other in terms of the types of content and the way that they present content. And so we've had to manage those sort of imbalances as we go. Like I said, this is all good to keep in mind, these types of issues as you're looking at digital platforms to present your materials. So next, please. House number 3, our last category for digital platforms, is actually not so much of a platform as it is a type of material. We also create low resolution PDFs of whole folders or collections, depending on the size. And that is to aid in remote research. We, because of COVID, have been closed to the public. We are still closed to the public, though we are now back open to students, faculty, and staff on campus. But even that being said, we have research requests coming from all over the country. Not everyone can make it to Appleton. And so to accommodate that, we scan things at a lower resolution as a reference copy only, PDF. We store those on internal servers here, and I email them to researchers when necessary. This speeds up the process of research requests, though obviously is not a digitization solution in the long run. Oh, next, please. So standardization is key across all of the platforms that we are using, right? 3 platforms or houses makes it means that there's a lot of content out there and a lot of metadata variability here. So it's really been a key to our success to try to uniform and standardize that metadata and other aspects to it. So across all our platforms, we have 2 different standards for images that we're creating as we digitize. One is for the master copies, and then one is for those reference or access copies. Obviously, those PDFs in house number 3 qualify under that access quality standard, and we don't create a master copy quality image for those. But in the other 2 cases, for Lux and Artstore presentations, we do create master copies. Oftentimes, we do not also create access copies right away, so it's something to consider if your server space is a concern. Because those access copies, right, it's a duplicate, though at lower resolution means a smaller file size. We are often creating those access copies as they're being requested. The nice thing about Artstore is that we can upload our master copy, and when you look at it as a user and download an image from their website, the website itself creates an access copy for you. We don't have to host those access copies ourselves. Something else to consider for standardization is color correction. Color matching is something that often gets forgotten about and left aside, but I highly, highly encourage you to take the time to do that work of standardizing what the image that you're looking at on the screen looks like compared to the one that is sitting, the object that's sitting in front of you, right? We want the user experience online to be as similar as possible to holding the object in person in our reading room. So color correcting as best as you can to make sure that the paper in front of you looks like the paper on the screen is important to do. And then the last is to manage your metadata. I keep coming back to this over and over and over again, and I will die on that hill because metadata really is key. As long as you're digitizing material, you still have to know how to find it, right? You can find it maybe in your folders, in your boxes, in your storage spaces, but you need to also be able to find it digitally as well. So for us, we have standardized our metadata across all of our platforms. That's the 3 digital presentations, as well as our archives catalog, which is an archive space installation. And so we've decided that the same types of metadata are required across all of those fields. Now, some of our platforms require different metadata than others, right? Like I said, Lux and Artstore have sort of discrepancies against each other. We have standard metadata we require on all of our platforms, regardless of what the platform itself is requiring. So for example, everyone needs a title, but not everyone needs a creator. Well, we require a creator, right? So that type of thing. Artstore, for example, requires a country of origin, which is an interesting category. Obviously, other platforms don't require that. We don't feel it's necessary. So we do it in Artstore, but we don't do it everywhere else because our collecting scope is focused to Lawrence and Milwaukee Downer. So the country of origin is sort of an irrelevant category for us. This also means that we duplicate our controlled vocabularies across our platforms as well. So keep that in mind if you're using things like drop-down menus or selecting tools. Those are controlled vocabularies you can create. And so we do that consistently across our platforms. Next, please. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, but Lina, how do you actually decide what to digitize, right? Digitization on demand means that there has to be a demand somewhere, right? Yes, this picture is lovely. This is Maxie. He's a campus dog. He had no real owner on campus. He sort of just lived around and people fed him, and he spent a good 10 or 12 years on campus, which is pretty great. No one knows how he arrived on campus either. So you might be asking, how do you choose what to digitize? Well, my answer to you is don't choose what to digitize, choose what not to digitize, right? Don't ask yourself, when do I digitize, but when not to digitize. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but keep that in mind as a framework as we start talking about digitization on demand and what that really means. Next, please. So as I said at the beginning, we take a piecemeal approach. Digitization on demand is really what that is called. You can call it whatever you'd like. This is sort of the term that gets used in archival spaces. It's a process in which researchers generally request the digitization of specific, or in some cases, not so specific materials, and we digitize them. Here at Lawrence, me and my 10 hours of student labor a week, my student workers, we expand on this by digitizing materials at a high image quality every time we're asked to digitize, and then we publish those online. So when it's appropriate, right? So we make that digitization process work for us rather than us working for a researcher, and the digitization being solely for that researcher. So for example, say a researcher wants a photo of Milwaukee Downer's field day, like this one here. We have a folder of material about field day at Milwaukee Downer. So instead of scanning a single item, we expanded the scope to include the rest of the materials in the folder. So instead of scanning one image at middling quality, which is all the researcher needed, instead we ended up scanning 12 photographs and 7 programs at high quality for digital preservation. So it can turn one image like this into the next slide. into all of these images. So all of these things are now available online for the general public to view and download and use because the researcher requested that one image on the previous slide, right? So it's a really great tool to maximize your efforts. Another great example is a student handbook that's available in Lux right now. A professor requested it as part, or sections of it as part of a resource for a remote class they were teaching this spring. Instead of only digitizing the specific sections or a couple of pages they needed, we went ahead and digitized it in its entirety and is now available online for the general public. So that last category of digital material I mentioned, those PDFs in house number 3, obviously they're not available publicly online. We don't publish those things in that manner. It's a process that's still in flux, how we create those digital PDFs and store them and share them with researchers. And I highly encourage you to tweak your process as you go. This is one that luckily is a back-end process for us. So there's not really an impact to the public, but it makes a big difference to find where your discrepancies are in terms of how long you think something will take to do and how long it'll actually take, you know, things like that. It's always good to keep iterating on your processes. Yeah, so that obviously doesn't fall into these categories, but you want a single item, right? And that PDF is created by scanning the whole folder. This is where the researchers request something that's not so specific comes into play here. You're interested, say, in the history of one of the houses that was used as a dormitory. Well, I have a whole folder of material. I don't know what you want by the history of that house, right? So I can, instead of sort of going back and forth with you and doing that guesswork and kind of really fine-tuning what you're looking for, instead I can say, oh, well, welcome to the archives virtually. Here's the folder on that house. Have a look through, and if there's anything else, any other information I can provide to you, I'd be happy to do so. So we're scanning those at lower resolution to sort of be able to virtually flip through that material. Next, please. So why digitize on demand, right? It's the idea of when not to digitize versus when to digitize. Digitization on demand, especially for a small institution or small staff or volunteer capacity, your time is at a premium. And so this method can maximize your time while getting a digital output that is substantial, right? So the other nice thing about this is that digitization on demand can create your digitization priorities for you, right? Your researchers are leading the charge in what you're choosing to digitize. That's not to say that they're the only people creating your priorities, but they definitely have a big influence on it, right? We do add our own priorities here. We run an active social media presence, both on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We're constantly digitizing material for that. And we take the same approach for those items as we do for research requests. So for an image that I'm posting online, I might scan a whole folder of photographs rather than just the one I'm posting online for social media. In many cases, we also scan materials that are used to fulfill research requests that don't include a digitization request. So an example of this is I recently had a researcher ask the date of commencement in 1971. They wanted the specific date that it was held. So I went to our commencement program from 1971, and I realized that instead of just telling them what the date is, I could spend the next 20 minutes scanning the program, and that way it could be put online and other people can look through it and have their questions answered without me having to constantly go back to that box, pull out the program, and give them the information, right? So it's cutting down on research requests in many ways, at least those very basic entry-level requests, and instead providing that information online. Now, I will say that this, the program, I really just recently scanned it, so it's not available online yet, but it will be in Lux, hopefully sometime this summer. I had to put that on hold for all sorts of records management projects that cropped up this month. So another approach, flexibility that this kind of creates for you is that your time is really maximized, right? So if I know it takes me 5 minutes to go and pull that box and have the answer to that research request of what date commencement was, well, instead of the 5 minutes, I could spend 20 minutes and get a digitization result out of that, right? So bite-sized pieces of digitization can really maximize your output by kind of constantly being in this process. The more we do, right, at every step helps chip away at that massive mountain that is sort of looming above our heads saying everything should be digitized. Well, not everything maybe needs to be digitized, but it's a big undertaking to digitize everything you have. But it's not a big undertaking to digitize the folder in your hand, right? That's where the frame of mind needs to change of saying, when do I not digitize something versus when do I digitize something? I find that having the framework of when do I not digitize something really opens the doors to me to assume that everything can and could be digitized. So why not do it now? Digitization also in smaller segments like this can allow for some of that standardization of metadata to be variable across platforms. It's much less daunting of a task to have to process and catalog all of these digital assets that you're creating across different platforms if you're doing it piecemeal, right? 5 photographs in our 3 different locations is a much simpler task than 50 photographs in 3 separate locations. And if I'm only scanning 5 photographs because it's all that's in the folder, I should do those now as the process completely through, rather than waiting until I have 50 scanned and then to catalog all of them, right? And lastly, it really does allow for digitization to be integrated into multiple workflows across job duties. So volunteers, student workers, or your full-time staff or part-time staff, right? If you have a staffing change and you have a big digitization project running, that staffing change can interrupt your project and maybe stop your project completely or postpone it. But if everyone that you can get your hands on basically can learn how to do some part of your digitization workflow, and you're constantly doing it and you make it part of everyone's job duties, then you're constantly digitizing material, and turnover both of staff and volunteers won't interrupt your digitization work as much as a big project might. So next slide, please. So I will prove to you that it works, and I recommend that no matter what method of digitization that you do, definitely metrics are key. You want to be able to go back to people and say, see, this is the output that we've had, you should give us money to do more, right? Without those metrics, no one will know how much you've done, and you can't show anyone the progress you're making. So here are some metrics that I think are important and really demonstrate digitization on demand for us. So in 2020, even with a pandemic, we digitized 120 items, individual items. That meant that I did all the scanning because I was the only one allowed in the building. And my students working remotely cataloged them in the appropriate platforms that they were hosted in. So far in 2021, we've digitized almost as many items, and it's June. And in large part, that's because my student workers are back on site. And so the scope of digitization has been able to be widened, right? That program, the course or the commencement program can be digitized now because I have someone who can spend the 20 minutes to scan it rather than me just really needing the 5 minutes to answer the research request and move on. So those numbers really make a big difference. It's how we have over time been able to put over 2,500 individual items online available in Artstore. That number is growing literally every week. And that's a really great number to be able to say that we have 2,500 items just in Artstore, never mind in Lux, which is a lot different sort of types of material. And that's because we are, even as a one-person outfit for the last 15 years, we've been able to slowly add to our digital assets. So in comparison to that, there are a couple of years that we've had specific digitization projects running. Normally they're student-run projects, so they're not massive, but they definitely increase our output for the year. In those years, we've resulted in about 200 items being posted on Artstore. So we are on track now with digitization on demand here to exceed that output this year alone, and that's without a specific digitization project. So next slide, please. To me, at least, it's clear that expanding our digitization on demand efforts to include related materials besides the ones that your researcher is requesting can make a world of difference. So I implore you to try this method, but obviously it's not for everyone. So I'm happy to take any questions, answer any lingering questions or thoughts that anyone might have on this. I'm also available via email. You can follow us on social media and check out all our digital assets as well there. So yeah, does anyone have any questions?
I'm just helping prompt conversation in the chat.
Scrapbooks are great actually for digitization on demand. I don't do them currently because I am down a scanner that is the right size. So at the moment I can't do them, but scrapbooks are great for digitization on demand because you can really take a piecemeal approach to doing those. Both the items within scrapbooks and the whole scrapbook pages themselves. It's okay to come back and do 5 pages at a time of a scrapbook and not the whole thing all at once, right? Piecemeal approaches really are a huge benefit I have found, because I can find 10 minutes to scan something. I can't find 10 hours to scan something necessarily, but the 10 minutes every time I go to scan really add up to those 10 hours pretty quick. Kitty, that's a great point. You've been digitizing on demand since you started because you don't know how else to go about it. Well, there are folks that definitely do this as big digitization projects, right? There's nothing wrong with big digitization projects. They really help a lot of folks. I have a small digitization project running this summer with a student. So that just because I do digitization on demand as sort of my natural mode doesn't mean that you can't coincide with big digital projects. So I have a student who's specifically working for me this summer just scanning yearbooks, because we have 150 years of yearbooks and there are only about 20 of them online, and they are something that people ask for like literally every day. So I think it's more of a mindset rather than a protocol to follow in this case.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Lina. I appreciate all your time and expertise. I definitely I'm going to come to you when I have other things I'm going to digitize once I have the time, but the digitization on demand sounds like a perfect recipe for getting more stuff online.
Yeah, the nice, also one more thing to say actually about it is that because you're digitizing in smaller pieces, it's really easy to troubleshoot, right? If I have an item and I have no idea how to scan it, well, I don't have to figure out how to digitize, 100 of that item. I can just figure out how to do that one and then go back for the rest, right? So I think that it's a great tool for using your community of practice, especially to troubleshoot, be like, how do I do this one item, right? It's a lot easier to say, how do we, it's a lot easier to say that than to say, how do we digitize the 3,000 open reels sitting on my shelves, right? That's a huge undertaking. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
guys for
again. I
having
hope
me.
everybody has learned a lot so far. I know I have. I've learned a ton today, and I thought I was kind of an expert, and I mean, this just shows that we all have room to grow and room to learn, and it's great to be able to learn from each other. Before we transition to our last break, we just have one question that we posed earlier that you can ponder and feel free to share in chat. The question is, what digital readiness questions or needs do you or your organization have? So you can feel free to answer that in chat, or we're going to have a post-fair social time after our last session today. So you can feel free to